We're moving now on to Teresa Marques. She's from Portugal. She's going to give us an update and a report on the situation regarding women's sex-based rights in Portugal. So thank you so much for coming, Teresa, and over to you.
I haven't lived in Portugal for quite some time now, for some years, so I had to consult official documents that exist. And I will be explaining the situation of women's rights in Portugal in connection with the CEDAW, the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women and Girls. So as most of you probably know, but in case you don't, I'll repeat what the CEDAW is. So CEDAW is the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women and Girls. There's a committee which is part of the United Nations Human Rights Organizations. And what it does, it's an international human rights treaty that focuses on women's rights and women's rights issues worldwide. It has essentially three types of focus. One is equality, another is non-discrimination, and the final one is state obligations. And when they talk about women's rights, the first article mentions by that it's understood discrimination of women on the basis of their sex. So that's fairly explicit. Why does this matter? Well, it's become quite evident, for instance, now that we're living under the pandemic, that structural inequalities that affect women as a sex-based class have never been eradicated. The pandemic has only made it more clear. So the United Nations women themselves have collected information on this. And so you can see that what the pandemic has done is exposed structural inequalities across every sphere, from health to economy, to security, and women and girls around the world face disproportionate impacts. And so I'll say a little bit about how this is going on in Portugal as well. What this has meant is that hard-fought gains for women's rights are also under threat. So when we talk about state obligations, what does this mean? When a state ratifies a CEDAW, what is the state committed to? So it's one of the more widely ratified conventions worldwide. It's been ratified by 188 countries, and Portugal ratified it in 1980, which is quite a long time ago. It is a legally binding document, and the Portuguese government is obligated under the articles of the convention to effectively implement it. What this means is that all branches of government, the legislative, executive, and judiciary branches, are bound to implement the Convention Against the Discrimination of Women. So how does that happen? So every 4 years, Portugal must report to the CEDAW committee how the government does a bunch of things, namely how it respects the rights of women. For instance, it can't enact discriminatory laws or engage in discriminatory practices, how the government protects and promotes the rights of women, for instance, by making sure that there are mechanisms for complaints and redress, and that it regulates and sanctions private actors who do discriminate against women, and that it fulfills the rights of women by providing conditions that will ensure the equality in law and in actuality. How does the government report? So how does Portugal report? Well, in Portugal, there is a platform called the Portuguese Platform for Women's Rights. It is a non-governmental organization whose members are all women's rights non-governmental organizations as well. It was created only in 2004. And what it does is it collects information and it produces shadow reports for the CEDAW committee. And it also then asks questions to the government when the government produces its own reports, and asks questions about how it's doing and gives recommendations, let's say. So the latest report is quite recent. It already covers the period of the pandemic, and it was prepared in October of last year. So I'll now explain a little bit about what's in this report. I can't cover all of it because that's impossible and I don't have the time, but I'll just give you a little bit of an information here. So there are both positive and negative aspects in the period under review. There were some positive developments and there were a few negative developments, right? Some of the negative developments is that the positive aspects that they fell short of expectations. Others were the fact that there were concerns that had been highlighted in previous reports that were not addressed. And there are new, very worrying trends. For instance, there's an increase in hate speech against women. And as I said, also in Portugal, the pandemic is threatening to roll back a lot of women's rights. Portugal is not a wealthy country. It has improved since it's joined the European Union, but it's still not a wealthy country. And now women are suffering a great deal with the pandemic. So just very briefly on positive developments, I won't read all of this, but if you want to have a look. So Portugal has been taking steps to reach parity in political and social representation. So for instance, in political life, now there are more women participating than ever, around 40% of women in political life, although we still haven't had a woman president or a woman prime minister. In boards and audit bodies, I think it's similar to other developed nations where women are not a majority and they haven't reached parity in any way. In public administration and higher education, universities, etc., women are around 40% nowadays. One of the greatest areas of progress is that it concerns education and research. So women in science and technology, studying science and technology in Portugal are now around 57% of the total people doing science and technology studies, which is a good number. And probably Portugal is one of the countries that is doing better in this regards. And there's also new legislation where Portugal is committed to match obligations in the context of the Istanbul Convention against Violence Against Women. Some of the limitations of these developments. So there are many of the limitations have to do with language and how things like the adoption of the Istanbul Convention are framed in the legislation in Portugal. For instance, with respect to sexual violence, the law doesn't have a concept of consent. It has something like a very weird concept like the knowable will of the victim of sexual violence, whether it's possible to know or would it have been possible to know, rather than the person, whether the woman gave consent. There are other issues that language impacts on developments. For instance, rape crisis or sexual violence referral centers are called crisis centers, not specifically rape crisis centers. And so that means that financial support specific for rape crisis centers or for sexual violence victims is not specifically foreseen. And there are only 2 specialized support services for women and girls that are victims of sexual violence in Portugal. The impact of the pandemic, as I was saying, so this is a very serious in recent years. So women are losing their jobs at a faster rate than men. Women are more infected by COVID than men are. Both facts are to be explained by the fact that women in general do lower paying jobs and are in the care industries or services. And so they are more exposed to infection, and they also have more vulnerable positions, and so they lose their jobs. Women are also facing trouble with the reconciliation between work and family life. And considering that there is a gender pay gap in the family when someone has to decide who's going to stay home to help the care of the elderly or to care for children, it's usually the women who give up on the employment. So the impact on the pandemic is manifest also in regards to violence against women, for instance. So most of the domestic violence victim support services are funded through social games like the lottery, and people are spending less money on these kinds of things. And so there's less money to go around for all the services. Whereas I think this has also happened in other countries. Intimate partner violence that was pre-existing, it has worsened during the lockdown, and incoming calls for domestic violence support lines has increased considerably during the first lockdown last year, for instance. On the negative developments that are really worrying, there is an increase in misogynistic hate speech. This has been heard there's a new far-right party that has said many bad things. There's a lot of misogynistic and hate speech against women online, on social media. That's also not exclusive of Portugal, of course. There are other aspects about changes in language. So, for instance, there was a Commission for Equality and Women's Rights, which is now called the Commission for Citizenship and Gender Equality, and that negatively impacts on women's rights visibility. There are problems with funding for women's rights NGOs, so there's no consistent or reliable funding. And more recently, so in 2018, there was a new law was adopted on the self-determination of gender identity, gender expression, and the protection of sex characteristics. And what is worrying is that it seems to have been done without prior consultation in connection with CEDAW and its impacts on women, which, as I said in the beginning, is something that the government is required to do, is required to check any new legislation, whether it has a negative impact on the discrimination of women on the basis of their sex, of our sex. So I'll say a little bit before I finish, I'll say a little bit about this. So in general, there's a lack of knowledge in public administration and in judiciary on CEDAW. It's the platform for the defense of the rights of women that's been trying to inform the public and institutions about CEDAW, about the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, not the government specifically. The news is basically hopeless because they confuse all terminology. So they confuse gender with gender as a social kind, with gender identity, with gender expression, and sex. So people will swap these terms around without really understanding what it is they're talking about. And as I said, the government doesn't always do proper consultations and assessment of new legislation and how it may impact on women and girls. So in this new legislation from 2018, in February, the government had indeed approved a bill that says that drafted bills or legislative acts that are prepared by the central and regional administration, as well as drafts and bills submitted to Parliament, shall be subject to prior gender impact assessment. But then later in the same year, the new law on the right of self-determination of gender identity was approved, and apparently without being subject to a gender impact assessment. There's a question of whether it hasn't been subject to a gender impact assessment yet, or whether it will at some point be. So the final slide that I have is the question that the Platform for the Defense of Women's Rights in Portugal has addressed to the government was the following. So they say, information before the committee indicates that legislation prohibiting sex-based discrimination has been superseded by gender-neutral legislation and policies and measures to address discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. So they ask the government to please provide information about the effects of that approach on the recognition of de facto discrimination against women and indicate the measures that can be taken to promote substantive equality between women and men in accordance with the state's parties' obligations under the articles of the convention. So that's basically the recent information that I have to give, and I'll leave these links. So if you want to consult, not just with respect to Portugal, but also to respect to other countries, you have on the United Nations Human Rights Treaties database, you can consult the information, the reports from CEDAW with respect to the country in question, and you can also consult the reports from the countries themselves, right? So both the CEDAW and the countries' reports. And if you want to see more about the work from the Portuguese Platform for Women's Rights, here's the link on the bottom. You have here the link for the platform, right? They act on behalf of CEDAW in Portugal. I would have to say that many of the structural levels of inequality and discrimination that affect women in Portugal, as in other countries, they just reveal that the legal changes in the law in terms of the language that is used just makes it, completely evident that stopping to talk of women in terms of sex, but to talk in terms of gender is completely irrelevant to the ways that women are being affected in terms of giving up on their work, the difficulty that women had, for instance, in having children on their own, something that I didn't mention. Women during childbirth, they couldn't have company for 2 weeks if they were infected with COVID, for instance. These are things that affect only women. And so it's essential that the law does not stop to protect women as a sex-based class in the countries in which it still does. And where the law is changing, it is important that we have a safeguard for specific issues that impact on women's equality and discrimination.